This session is basically to give you an introduction to ADO.NET. So let's drag and drop the grid view control, and you can find the grid view control under data tab. So expand that, drag and drop the grid view control onto the web form, and then you can auto format that to make it look nicer. Let's select brown sugar, click OK. Now go to the code behind file. Now look at this. This is .NET application. Now this .NET application has to connect to a SQL server and execute a SQL command, retrieve data, and display that within this .NET application. Now if you look at .NET and SQL Server, they are two different technologies. Now SQL Server will not understand C# or VB or any .NET programming languages. SQL Server only understands SQL. So from within your .NET application, if this .NET application has to get the data available in SQL Server. Now in SQL Server I have a table called TBL product, and that's present in this sample table. So obviously if the .NET application has to communicate with SQL Server and retrieve data from there, the .NET application first must establish a connection to SQL Server. Next, it has to prepare a SQL command and issue that command to the server and execute that. And once you have the results back, display that within the application. So obviously we first need to create a connection. Okay. Now remember, we are connecting to the SQL Server. So all the classes that help me to connect to SQL Server are present in a namespace called system.data.sql client. Okay, system.data.sql client. So first of all, I need to establish the SQL connection. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection. Now don't worry about these objects, we will be talking about them in a very great detail in a later session. The idea of this session is basically to understand or to have a high level overview of what ADO.NET is all about. Okay, so obviously to connect to a SQL server, you need to tell to this connection object what's the name of the server, and within that server which database do you want to connect to, and what's the user ID and password to connect. So you have to provide that information to this connection object, otherwise it will not be able to connect to the SQL server. So I will have to use data source property, and data source is equal to dot, which means connect to a local instance of SQL server. Database is equal to sample. So if you look at the database here within which we have our table, it's the sample database. And I'm going to specify integrated security is equal to SSPI. Now what does this mean? This means that I am using Windows authentication to connect to the SQL server. Now again, as I told you, don't worry too much about this object here and about this connection string. We'll be talking about them in great detail in next parts in this video series. Here the whole idea is to get an high level overview of what ADO.NET is all about and what do we mean by .NET data providers. Okay, so I have the SQL connection object. The next thing is we have to prepare the SQL command. So obviously SQL Server only understands SQL. So we have to issue the SQL command from within the .NET application. So let's prepare the SQL command, and to prepare that I use the SQL command object. SQL command cmd is equal to new SQL command, and then we need to specify the command. So select star from TBL product and execute this command using this connection object. So you have to pass that as parameter as well. Okay, so we have the command. Now open the connection. So I'm opening the connection. Now after you open the connection to the SQL server, execute the command. So execute reader. This will execute the command and retrieve the results from the database. So once I execute this method, it's going to return the data back in the form of a SQL data reader. So I'm going to store that in a SQL data reader object. Let's call it as RDR. So when I execute this command using this method, look at the IntelliSense. The IntelliSense says it's going to return a SQL data reader object. So I'm storing that results back in that object. And then all I'm doing is we have this grid view 1 control. I'm setting the data source property of that control to RDR, meaning whatever data that we have got back, assign that to the data source property of the grid view control. And then finally call grid view 1.dataBind. So bind the data and then finally close the connection. Alright, so it seems so simple until now. Okay, so if you look at this, as I told you, don't worry too much about this code. We are going to talk about every object that we see here in a very great detail in later sessions. Alright, so we are preparing the connection object. Using this connection string, we are telling which database in which server we want to connect to, and then you're preparing the SQL command object, and then you're telling execute this command on this connection object, open the connection, execute the command, whatever result you get back, store that in this SQL data reader object, and then use that data reader as the data source for your grid view control, and then call the data bind method. So now obviously when we run this application, what should happen? The .NET application should establish a connection to the SQL server, issue this command select star from TBL product, execute that, retrieve the result, and bind that to this grid view control that we have. And as you can see, the result is here. Now if you notice here, I'm connecting to the SQL server. Okay, so my backend is SQL Server for this application, for the .NET application. Now, can a .NET application get data from an Oracle database? Absolutely, it can get data from any database. Okay, any database, not only databases, even from XML files, text files, etc. Okay, now we know how to connect to SQL Server. Now how do I connect to Oracle Server? Now again, it's very simple. Now can I use the SQL connection object, SQL command, and SQL data reader objects to connect to Oracle database? No, different databases use different protocols. So obviously there are no universal set of classes that can actually accomplish that. So if you want to connect to SQL Server, you are using the classes SQL connection, SQL command, SQL data reader that's present in this namespace system.data.sql client. Okay, now let's say I want to connect to an Oracle database. Then how do I do that? Now, if you know how to connect to one database, then connecting to another database is no big deal. It's just that you use a different class, different objects. But the concept is the same. You have to prepare the connection object, you have to prepare the command, you have to execute that, and then store the results in a reader object, and then bind that to a control. So let's look at that. So let's say let's comment these lines for the time being. Actually, let me copy those and then comment those lines. So I'm copying them. Let's paste that. Let's uncomment these lines now. So now if I want to connect to Oracle database, all I do is instead of saying SQL connection, I say Oracle connection. And remember, this Oracle connection is actually present. If I say system.go to definition, this is present in system.data.oracle client namespace. Okay, so Oracle connection is equal to new Oracle connection. And instead of using SQL command, as you might have guessed by now, you use Oracle command. Is equal to new Oracle command, because the data source that I am talking to is now going to be Oracle. And again, instead of SQL data reader, Oracle data reader command dot. Look at this. The exact same code. All I have changed is instead of using SQL connection, I'm using Oracle connection. Instead of using SQL command, we are using Oracle command. Instead of using SQL data reader, we are using Oracle data reader. Okay, and another difference is that this Oracle connection is actually present in system.data.oracle client namespace. So what